Sometimes justice isn't found in thick law books or rigid statutes. True justice lies in the eyes of the beholder, okay? In the ability to look past the surface and see the human being standing right in front of you. There are mornings when a single detail can tell a story of heroism and tragedy. Let me tell you about a Tuesday morning when an old military uniform stopped me in my tracks. His name was James Miller, a 68-year-old man facing a thick stack of paperwork. He had 12 separate citations for illegal overnight parking and expired registration, with fines ballooning to over $800. To most, this looked like negligence, a complete disregard for the law. But when I looked closer at the timestamps, I noticed a strange pattern. All the tickets were issued between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m., all in the same desolate public lot behind Roger Williams Park. Why would a man pushing 70 be parking in a park at 3 in the morning in the dead of a Providence winter? Why wasn't he safely parked in his own driveway? The paperwork said serial offender, but my gut, after 30 years on the bench, told me something was wrong. When the bailiff called James Miller, the doors opened, and that's when I saw him. He walked slowly with a slight limp, his shoulders a bit hunched. He wasn't wearing a suit, but a faded olive drab military jacket, an old M65 from the Vietnam era. On his left chest, right over his heart, were patches that had been carefully hand-stitched back on despite being frayed by time. He approached the bench, his calloused hands clasped tightly on the table. He stood there in silence, looking me in the eye with absolute respect. But behind it lay a deep, crushing sadness. "Good morning, Mr. Miller." I found myself trying to get a better look at that uniform as I listed the charges. 12 counts of illegal overnight parking and expired registration, totaling nearly $900. I asked him simply, "Do you have an explanation for these violations?" James Miller took a deep breath and offered no excuses. He didn't blame the police or claim ignorance of the law. He just nodded slightly and said, "Your Honor, I have no defense. I parked there, and I take full responsibility for my actions." I was too resigned, like a soldier accepting a reprimand without complaint. But his eyes weren't the eyes of a criminal. They were the eyes of a man trying to hold on to his last shred of dignity. I looked down at the tickets, then back up at the 101st Airborne patch on his jacket. "Mr. Miller," I interrupted, gesturing toward it, "I see you're wearing a uniform. Did you serve in the military?" In that moment, his posture changed. He stood a little taller, a flash of pride breaking through. "Yes, Your Honor," he replied, his voice gravelly and deep. "I served 20 years in the United States Army. I did tours in Vietnam and was stationed in Germany. I retired in 1995 as a master sergeant." "Thank you for your service," I said sincerely, and the whole room seemed to want to say it with me. But I had to get to the heart of the matter, the question that was gnawing at me. Sergeant Miller, a soldier with 20 years of service, a man who understands discipline better than most. Why did you violate parking laws 12 times in a row at 3 in the morning? I paused, looking directly at him. Why didn't you just park at your house? The question hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. James Miller looked down at his trembling hands. The soldier's pride vanished, replaced by a naked truth he had been trying so hard to hide. He remained silent for a long time, so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Then he looked up, his eyes rimmed with red, his voice breaking. "Your Honor, that car is my home." The silence in the courtroom was deafening after he spoke those words. It wasn't the quiet of a pause. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of shock. Everyone from the bailiff to the clerk stopped what they were doing and looked at the man in the faded green jacket. The reality hit us all at once. A decorated veteran was sleeping in the back seat of a sedan in the middle of winter. I looked down at the 12 citations again, but they looked completely different now. They weren't just parking tickets anymore. They were attacks on poverty. This man wasn't paying for a place to leave his vehicle. He was being fined for existing. Every night, he tried to find a safe place to rest his head. And the system punished him for it, Mr. Miller, I said softly, my voice losing all its judicial sternness. You served 20 years. You had a pension. You had a life. I leaned forward, needing to understand the tragedy before me. How did this happen? How does a master sergeant end up living in his car? James wiped a tear from his cheek with a shaking hand, his composure finally beginning to crack. It wasn't gambling, Your Honor, and it wasn't drink, he said quietly, his voice trembling. It was Martha, my wife of 40 years. She got sick 3 years ago, cancer, stage 4. He took a ragged breath before continuing, staring past me as if into a memory. The insurance didn't cover everything. It didn't cover the experimental treatments or the specialized hospice care she needed. I sold the house to pay the bills. I sold the furniture, the savings, bonds, everything we had to make her comfortable. I promised her I wouldn't let her be in pain, he whispered, a sob catching in his throat. And I kept that promise, Your Honor. I kept it until the very end. But when she passed last winter, there was nothing left. No house, no savings, just an empty bank account and a broken heart. The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear the hum of the lights. So I moved into the car, he explained simply, as if it were the only logical choice left. The shelter's not safe for an old man like me. People steal your shoes while you sleep. I couldn't handle the noise and the danger. He looked up at me, his eyes pleading for understanding. The park is quiet at night. I park under the lights near the maintenance shed because it feels safer there. I wasn't trying to cause trouble, Your Honor. I was just trying to sleep without fear. I sat back in my chair, feeling a heavy weight settle deep in my chest. Here was a man who had protected our country for 2 decades, standing before me because his country had failed to protect him. He had sacrificed his entire future for the love of his wife, and his reward was a stack of parking tickets and a cold night in a parking lot. I looked at Inspector Quinn, the police officer who usually presented the cases. Even he looked shaken, staring at his notes with a troubled expression. We were enforcing the law, yes, but in that moment, the law felt cruel. It felt like we were kicking a man who was already down on his knees. I looked down at the court docket in front of me. $840 to the city administration. It was just a number, a receivable debt on a spreadsheet. But looking at the man standing before me, I knew that sum might as well have been $1 million. Mr. Miller, I asked gently, trying to piece together his daily reality. You mentioned you have no savings. How are you surviving? How do you put gas in the car to keep warm at night? How do you eat? James straightened his jacket, a flicker of that old soldier's pride returning for a brief second before fading. I have a small Social Security check, Your Honor, he answered, his voice barely a whisper. But it mostly goes to gas and a small storage unit. That's where I keep Martha's things, her photos, her wedding dress. I can't bring myself to throw them away. Okay, that detail hit me harder than anything else. He was starving himself and sleeping in the cold just to pay rent on a box of memories. He was holding on to the only pieces of his wife he had left, sacrificing his own comfort to honor her memory. It was a kind of loyalty that broke your heart. Inspector Quinn, who represents the police department in my courtroom, usually argues to uphold the fines. But today, he slowly stood up, taking off his hat. He looked at me, then at James, and shook his head slowly. Your Honor, Quinn said, his voice thick with emotion. The police department has no interest in collecting a dime from this man. We didn't know his situation. If the officers had known he was a veteran living in his car, they never would have written these tickets. I nodded, appreciating Quinn's decency. I agree, Inspector, I said, but dismissing these tickets isn't enough. If I wipe the slate clean right now, Mr. Miller walks out those doors and goes right back to that parking lot tonight. He gets another ticket tomorrow, or worse, he freezes to death. We're treating the symptom, not the disease. I looked at James Miller, shivering slightly in his thin jacket despite the warmth of the courtroom. I realized that sitting on this bench, wearing this robe, wasn't enough today. I couldn't just be a judge applying the law. I had to be a human being first. I looked directly at the camera used for our show, then back at James. "Mr. Miller," I said firmly, leaning forward, "you spent 20 years serving us. You protected us. You sacrificed for us. Now it is our turn to serve you." James looked up, confusion washing over his tired face. He didn't know what I meant, and frankly, in that exact second, I didn't have a full plan yet. But I knew one thing for Sir James Miller was not sleeping in his car tonight. Not on my watch. I picked up the heavy black phone on my desk. I didn't care that court was technically in session, or that dozens of other cases were waiting to be heard. I dialed the direct line for the Director of Veterans Affairs for Rhode Island, a number I kept for emergencies just like this. The phone rang twice before clicking over to the speaker, echoing through the silent courtroom. "Director," I said, my voice steady but urgent. "I have a situation here that cannot wait until tomorrow. I have a master sergeant standing in front of me who is sleeping in his car." The room held its breath as we waited for the response. "Judge," the voice on the line crackled with hesitation, "we are currently at capacity. The winter shelters are completely full." My heart sank as I saw James look down at his worn boots, resigning himself to another freezing night in the parking lot. But I wasn't accepting no for an answer today. "Director," I said, leaning into the microphone and letting my frustration show. "This man gave 20 years to this country. He sold his house to pay for his dying wife's medical bills. I'm not asking you for a favor. I'm telling you, we need a bed." I paused, looking at James's trembling shoulders. If we don't help him, who will? If we turn our backs on him, what are we even doing here? I asked the phone, but I was really asking everyone in the room. There was a long, agonizing pause on the other end of the line. Then the voice softened, losing its bureaucratic tone. "You're right, Judge. Bring him in. If I have to give him my own office couch or pay for a hotel myself, we will find a place. Send him over immediately." I hung up the phone and looked back at James. Tears were streaming freely down his weathered face, dripping onto that faded green uniform. He tried to speak, to say thank you, but the words got stuck in his throat, choked back by overwhelming emotion. "You have a place to stay tonight, Mr. Miller," I told him gently. "A warm bed, a shower, a meal." But as I looked at him, I realized he was still worrying about something else, the fines. He still owed the city $840, and even with the bed, that debt would hang over him like a dark cloud. I knew the state could waive the fees, but I wanted to do something more personal. I reached for the small wooden box I keep on my bench. The Philomena Fund. It's named after my mother and used to help people who are trying to do the right thing, but just need a little help. I opened the box, then stopped. Giving him a few $100s would help, sure. But as I looked at the crowd in the courtroom and saw the tears in their eyes, I realized everyone in that room wanted to be part of the solution. What happened next was something I'd never seen in my 30 years on the bench. It started with Inspector Quinn, the big, tough police officer who spent his days enforcing the rules, stepped away from his podium. He didn't head for the exit. He walked straight up to the bench, reached into his back pocket, pulled out his wallet, and took out a $20 bill. He placed it gently on the wooden ledge in front of James. "Get yourself a hot breakfast, Sergeant," Quinn said, his voice rough with emotion. "You earned it." That single act was like a match dropped in dry grass. A young woman in the back row stood up. She was there for a speeding ticket, clutching her purse nervously, but she walked forward without hesitation. She placed a $10 bill next to Quinn's money and whispered, "Thank you for your service." Then a businessman in a suit stood up, then a college student, then the mother holding a baby. One by one, people waiting for their own cases began to form a line. They weren't coming forward to plead their innocence or argue their fines. They were coming to give what little they had to a stranger. James stood there, frozen in shock, as a small pile of cash began to grow on the judge's bench. $5 bills, singles, 20s. It was a mountain of crumpled paper, but to James it must have looked like a miracle. He covered his face with his weathered hands, his shoulders shaking violently as he wept openly. I sat there, stunned into silence. In all my years as a judge, I had never seen a courtroom spontaneously turn to a community. These people were strangers to one another, facing their own financial troubles and legal issues. Yet in that moment, none of that mattered. They saw a man who had given everything, and they could not bear to see him suffer. They weren't giving out of pity, but out of deep, instinctive gratitude. Even the bailiff, usually stoic and serious, had to wipe his eyes as he helped organize the donations. When the line finally ended, I asked him to count the money. The total came to over $400 cash, pulled straight from the pockets of everyday citizens. "Mr. Miller," I said, my voice thick, "this money isn't charity. This is a thank you. This is your community telling you that you matter, that you are seen, and that you are not alone." James lowered his hands, his face wet with tears, but glowing with disbelief. He looked at the pile of money, then at the people in the gallery. For the first time since he walked in, he didn't look like a tired, homeless man. He looked like a soldier who had finally come home. But I wasn't done yet. The community had done its part. Veterans Affairs had done theirs. Now it was the court's turn to lift the final burden from this man's shoulders. The courtroom grew quiet as the bailiff handed the cash to James. He held it tight against his chest, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. Still, the shadow of the law loomed. The docket showed nearly $900 in fines and fees. I picked up my pen and looked at the stack of 12 citations one last time. Under the strict letter of the law, he was guilty. He had parked illegally. But justice without mercy is just cruelty. And I refused to be part of a system that crushed a man for trying to survive. "Mr. Miller," I said, my voice cutting through the silence, "the people of Providence have spoken with their generosity. The Veterans Affairs Office has spoken with its support. Now it is time for the court to speak, okay?" Looked him in the eye and smiled. "I am dismissing all 12 parking citations. I am dismissing the expired registration charge, and I am dismissing the failure to appear warrant. You do not owe the city of Providence a single dime." She stared at me, his mouth slightly open, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "Dismissed," he stammered, his voice barely audible. "But, Your Honor, that's almost $1,000. I don't understand." "Zero now, Mr. Miller," I told him firmly. "You have paid your dues to this country 1,000 times over. It would be a stain on this court's conscience to take money from a man who gave everything he had for his family and his nation." I signed the paperwork with a flourish, the sound of the pen scratching across the paper echoing through the room. "You are walking out of here with a clean record, a pocket full of support from your neighbors, and a warm place to sleep tonight. Consider this a fresh start." James closed his eyes and let out a long, shuddering breath, the weight of months of homelessness leaving his body all at once. He wasn't just relieved, he was liberated. The look of constant worry etched into his face when he had walked in finally began to fade. "Thank you," he whispered, clutching his old military cap. I don't know what to say. I thought I was coming here to lose the little bit I had left. I never expected to find my life again." I leaned back, feeling a warmth in my chest that no amount of judicial prestige could ever provide. "Good luck, Sergeant," I said softly. "Go get some rest. You've been standing guard for too long." James turned to leave, clutching the money and his dismissal papers. The courtroom didn't remain still. For the second time that morning, applause broke out spontaneously. But the story didn't end when he walked out those doors. In fact, the most incredible part of James Miller's journey was just beginning. 6 months passed, and the daily grind of the courtroom continued. I saw thousands of faces and heard thousands of excuses, but I never forgot the man in the faded green jacket. I often wondered whether the system had failed him again, or whether that single act of kindness had truly changed anything then. On a bright Tuesday morning, the bailiff handed me a note. "There's a Sergeant Miller here to see you," he whispered, a knowing smile on his face. The doors opened, and the man who walked in was almost unrecognizable. The limp was gone. His stride was strong, and the haunting sadness that once shadowed his eyes had vanished. He wasn't wearing that thin, old military jacket anymore. Instead, he wore a crisp button-down shirt and clean slacks, looking like a new man. He approached the bench not as a defendant, but as a man who had reclaimed his dignity. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said, his voice clear, booming, and full of life, the voice of the master sergeant he had once been. James shared the news we had all hoped for. That call to the Director of Veterans Affairs hadn't just secured him a bed for one night. It had fast-tracked his entire case. Within 2 weeks of our court date, James had keys to his own small apartment in a veterans housing complex. For the first time in 3 years, "I have a front door I can lock," James said, beaming. "I have a kitchen. I have a bed that belongs to me. And most importantly, I have a safe place to keep Martha's ashes and her photos." But simply having a home wasn't enough for James. He told me he didn't want to sit idle in his new apartment. He wanted to be useful again. He had begun volunteering at the local shelter. It's the very same one he had once been afraid of. "I help the other old guys," he said with a smile. "I help them fill out the paperwork for their benefits. I tell them not to give up hope. I tell them about the day a judge in a room full of strangers saved my life." Then he did something that stunned me all over again. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope. He placed it gently on the bench, right where the pile of donations had sat 6 months earlier. "Your Honor," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "the people in this room gave me money when I had nothing. They bought me food and gas when I was starving. I promised myself I would pay it back." I looked at the envelope, confused. "Mr. Miller," I said softly, "that was a gift. No one expects you to repay that." James shook his head firmly. "I know, Judge, but I'm not giving it back to them. I want to give it to the next soldier who walks through those doors. I want to start a fund for veterans who have nowhere else to go." I stared at the white envelope on my bench, fighting back tears. Inside was every spare dollar James had saved over the last 6 months. A man who had been sleeping in his car not long ago was now the first to give back, proving that generosity has nothing to do with the size of a bank account. "We will do exactly that, Sergeant," I promised, placing my hand over the envelope. "This will be the first donation to a special fund for veterans in crisis right here in this court. Your struggle will become someone else's survival." James nodded, a look of deep peace settling over his face. He hadn't just found a home that day, he had found a purpose. He turned his suffering into a lifeline for others, proving that dignity, once restored, is a powerful force that ripples outward. He walked out of my courtroom not as a victim of the system, but as a benefactor to it. He was no longer the homeless man defined by parking tickets. He was Sergeant James Miller, a hero who continued to serve his country in a new way long after he took off the uniform. I'm Frank Caprio. Remember, behind every stack of tickets, behind every broken rule, there is a human story waiting to be heard. We are often so quick to judge the action that we forget to ask about the person. Sometimes, all it takes to change a life is to stop judging and start listening. Ask the questions that matter. Ask why instead of just what. You never know when you might meet a hero in disguise, just waiting for someone to truly see them. Thanks for listening, and God bless.